Some people say the frontier is a place where kindness dies quickly, but on one cold morning outside the dusty town of Red Mesa, Arizona Territory, a quiet widow named Sarah Whitmore was about to prove that kindness could still change the fate of an entire valley. The sun had not yet climbed above the low red hills when Sarah stepped out of her small wooden house and walked toward the barn that stood about 30 yards from her porch. The air smelled of dry sage and cooling earth, the kind of desert morning where the wind carried every sound across miles of open land. But that morning something felt wrong. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and thin gray smoke curled into the pale sky. Sarah stopped walking. Her boots pressed into the dirt as she stared across the yard, her hands tightening around the shawl wrapped over her shoulders. That barn had been standing for nearly 12 years, ever since her husband Thomas built it with his own hands before fever took him during the harsh winter of 1873. Every board, every nail, every beam carried the memory of a man who had once believed the frontier could become a peaceful home. Sarah slowly stepped closer, her breath shallow. The barn had not burned completely, but the walls were blackened and the roof sagged as if the building itself had grown tired of standing. The horses had been moved during the night, thankfully unharmed, but someone had clearly come here while darkness still covered the valley. Someone had wanted to send a message. Sarah did not need long to understand why. The town of Red Mesa had never been a place where people forgave easily, and lately whispers had followed her like shadows down every street. It had started 3 nights earlier, when the wind howled across the desert and a small figure appeared near the edge of her property just after sunset. Sarah had been feeding the chickens when she saw movement near the fence line. At first she thought it was a stray dog or perhaps a coyote, but then the figure stepped forward into the fading light. It was a child, no older than 8 or 9 years old, thin from travel and wrapped in a torn blanket that had once been bright with tribal patterns. His dark eyes carried the kind of fear that children should never have to learn. Sarah had lived on the frontier long enough to recognize what the town would see immediately. The boy was Apache. In Red Mesa, that single fact could turn neighbors into enemies. The Apache Wars had scarred this territory for decades, and many settlers carried memories of raids, stolen cattle, and lost relatives. Whether those stories were true or exaggerated no longer mattered. Fear had hardened into anger, and anger had hardened into hatred. Yet when the boy stood trembling near Sarah Whitmore's fence, she did not see an enemy. She saw a child who had walked too far through the desert alone. The boy had said almost nothing that night. Only 2 quiet words in careful English that sounded as though he had practiced them many times. "Please help." Sarah remembered looking across the darkening desert, knowing that helping him could cost her the fragile peace she still had in Red Mesa. She remembered the lantern light flickering against the barn wall as she opened the door and motioned the child inside. Sometimes the smallest decision on the frontier could echo louder than gunfire. And before the sun rose the next morning, the entire town would know what Sarah Whitmore had done. I remember the night clearly because the desert wind carried every sound across the valley, and the moment Sarah Whitmore opened the barn door for that frightened child, the quiet rhythm of her life began to change. Inside the barn, the lantern light swayed gently from a hook above the workbench, throwing long shadows across the wooden beams that Thomas had raised years ago. The boy stood just inside the doorway as if unsure whether he had stepped into safety or another kind of danger. His hair was dark and tangled with dust, and the blanket around his shoulders was stiff from dry desert sand. Sarah kept her voice calm, the same steady tone she used when calming a nervous horse. She told him he could sit near the hay bales while she brought water. The boy watched every movement carefully, the way a wild colt studies the hand reaching toward it. When Sarah returned with a tin cup, he drank slowly but did not take his eyes off her face. Trust on the frontier was never given quickly. After a moment, Sarah placed a small plate of bread and beans beside him. The boy hesitated, then nodded once in quiet gratitude before eating as if he had not seen a proper meal in days. Outside the barn the night deepened, and the distant howl of coyotes drifted across the red hills beyond Red Mesa. Sarah sat on a wooden crate nearby, studying the child in the lantern light. She had heard enough stories over the years to know that Apache families often traveled great distances through harsh country, and sometimes children were separated during raids, chases, or sudden storms. Whatever had brought this boy here, he clearly had no strength left to continue walking. After a long silence he finally spoke again, slowly choosing each word as though it were precious. He told her his name was Little Hawk. The name carried pride despite the exhaustion in his voice. Sarah nodded and introduced herself, though she doubted the name Whitmore meant anything to him. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. The lantern flame flickered softly while the desert wind pushed against the barn walls. Then Sarah made a decision that would quietly seal her fate in the eyes of Red Mesa. She spread a spare wool blanket across a bed of clean hay and told Little Hawk he could sleep there for the night. The boy looked surprised, almost confused, as though kindness itself had become unfamiliar during his journey. Within minutes he had curled beneath the blanket and fallen into a deep, silent sleep. Sarah remained awake much longer, listening to the wind and thinking about the town only 2 miles down the dusty road. Red Mesa was a settlement built on stubborn survival and uneasy memories. Most families had lost something during the years of conflict between settlers and tribes. Because of that, fear traveled faster than reason in those parts. If the townspeople discovered that she had sheltered an Apache child, many would believe she had betrayed her own people. Sarah understood all of that as clearly as she understood the cold desert stars outside. Yet when she looked at the sleeping boy beside the hay bales, she felt something stronger than fear. She felt the quiet certainty that no child deserved to face the desert alone. What Sarah did not realize was that someone had already seen a small shadow cross her fence line earlier that evening. And by sunrise the whispers would begin moving through Red Mesa like dry wind through brittle grass. Morning arrived slowly across the Arizona desert, the pale sun rising behind the red mesas and spreading thin gold light across the valley. Sarah Whitmore had slept only a few hours in the wooden chair beside the barn wall, waking each time the wind shifted or the horses stirred in their stalls. When the first light crept through the cracks between the boards, she stood quietly and stepped outside. The air carried that familiar dry chill that often lingered before the desert warmed. For a moment the land looked peaceful, almost innocent, as though nothing troubled the quiet stretch of ranches and dusty roads surrounding the town of Red Mesa. Sarah walked to the water pump and filled a bucket while the wind rustled through the brittle grass near the fence. Inside the barn Little Hawk was still asleep beneath the blanket, curled tightly like a traveler who had spent too many nights exposed to the cold. Sarah watched him for a moment and wondered where his family might be, or whether someone out there was searching for him across the endless desert. The frontier was vast enough to swallow people without leaving a trace. After feeding the horses and gathering fresh eggs from the coop, Sarah returned to the barn with a small piece of bread and a tin cup of water. When Little Hawk woke, his eyes opened quickly, alert the way children on the frontier often learn to be. For a moment he seemed confused about where he was, but when he saw Sarah standing nearby he relaxed slightly. The morning light revealed how young he truly was. Dust covered his boots and the edges of the blanket, and faint scratches lined his hands from thorn bushes and dry brush. Sarah knelt beside him and spoke gently, asking where he had come from and whether his family was nearby. Little Hawk hesitated before answering. His English was careful and slow, but understandable. He explained that he had been traveling with relatives across the desert when riders appeared far behind them near the foothills 2 days earlier. His family had told him to run toward the open land while they turned their horses in another direction. Since then he had walked alone, following the stars at night and hiding during the day whenever he saw smoke or distant riders. Sarah listened quietly, the weight of the story settling heavily in her mind. She knew the territory well enough to understand how dangerous those journeys could be for anyone, especially a child. Still, helping him further meant crossing a line that the people of Red Mesa would never forgive. Later that morning Sarah hitched her wagon and drove into town for flour and supplies. The road curved across 2 miles of open land before reaching the narrow street where the general store, the blacksmith shop, and the small sheriff office stood facing one another beneath the harsh desert sun. As she stepped down from the wagon, she noticed something unusual immediately. Conversations paused. 2 men leaning against the hitching rail stopped talking when she approached the store door. Inside, the shopkeeper greeted her politely but watched her with a strange expression that Sarah had learned to recognize over the years. Suspicion. Someone had already begun asking questions about what had happened near her property the previous night. By the time Sarah left the store, the quiet tension in the town felt heavier than the desert heat rising from the ground. She climbed back into the wagon, unaware that 3 men standing outside the saloon were watching her drive away toward the lonely stretch of land where her barn stood against the open horizon. The wagon wheels rolled slowly across the dry road as Sarah Whitmore guided the horses away from Red Mesa, yet the uneasy silence she had felt in town followed her like a shadow stretching across the desert floor. The sky had turned a pale blue above the distant mesas, and the sun climbed higher with every mile, warming the dust that drifted behind her wagon. Usually the road home brought a sense of quiet relief, but that morning Sarah could not shake the feeling that something had changed. The people of Red Mesa were not strangers to gossip. In a frontier town where days were long and lives often hard, rumors traveled faster than stagecoaches. Still, the way the men outside the saloon had watched her leave had carried something heavier than curiosity. It carried judgment. Sarah reached her property by late morning and stepped down from the wagon beside the barn. The land around her spread wide and empty, broken only by scattered sagebrush and the distant shape of red cliffs glowing beneath the sun. For a moment the ranch looked exactly as it always had, quiet and still, yet Sarah moved carefully as she opened the barn door. Inside, Little Hawk was sitting on the hay bale where she had left him earlier, the blanket folded neatly beside him. He stood when he saw her, his expression alert but calmer than the night before. Sarah set the small sack of flour and supplies on the workbench and offered him another piece of bread along with fresh water. The boy accepted both with a small nod. Even in daylight his movements remained cautious, as though he expected the world to shift against him at any moment. Sarah asked a few gentle questions about the direction he had traveled and whether he recognized any nearby mountains or rivers that might guide him back to his people. Little Hawk pointed toward the far western horizon where a jagged line of stone peaks rose faintly against the sky. Sarah knew those mountains. They marked the edge of territory where several Apache bands often moved through hidden valleys and rocky strongholds. If the boy's family was searching for him, they might already be somewhere within those distant hills. The thought brought Sarah a quiet hope, but also a difficult truth. Returning him safely might require more than simply pointing him toward the mountains. The land between Red Mesa and those ridges stretched for many miles of unforgiving desert. While Sarah and the boy spoke, the afternoon sun climbed higher and the air inside the barn grew warmer. Outside the wind carried the distant creak of wagon wheels somewhere along the road far beyond the ranch. Sarah paused for a moment, listening carefully. Travelers sometimes passed through the valley, but the sound faded quickly as though whoever rode the road had continued toward town instead of her property. She turned back toward Little Hawk, yet something about the quiet felt different now. In frontier country silence often meant people were watching from farther away than a person could see. As the afternoon drifted slowly toward evening, Sarah prepared a small meal beside the barn door while Little Hawk helped carry water from the pump. The boy worked without complaint, moving with the quiet discipline often taught within tribal families. For a short time the ranch felt peaceful again, almost ordinary. But across the open valley beyond the fence line, 3 riders had already begun moving along the distant road, their horses walking steadily through rising dust as they approached the lonely property where Sarah Whitmore had unknowingly stepped beyond the boundaries that Red Mesa believed no one should cross. The sun had begun its slow descent toward the red cliffs when the quiet rhythm of Sarah Whitmore's ranch finally broke. Sarah was standing beside the water pump, filling another bucket for the horses, while Little Hawk waited near the barn door holding the tin cup she had given him earlier. The desert wind had grown warmer through the afternoon, pushing waves of dust across the open land beyond the fence line. For most of the day nothing unusual had disturbed the silence except the distant call of a hawk circling high above the valley. That was why the sound of approaching horses reached Sarah's ears so clearly. At first it was only a faint vibration beneath the steady whisper of the wind, but within moments the rhythm became unmistakable. Hooves striking dry ground in a slow, deliberate pace. Sarah lifted her head and looked toward the road that curved across the empty stretch of desert leading from Red Mesa. 3 riders were approaching through a thin cloud of drifting dust. Even from a distance she recognized the way they rode, upright in their saddles with the casual confidence of men who believed the land belonged to them. Sarah felt a quiet weight settle in her chest. She did not need long to guess why they had come. News traveled quickly in small frontier towns, especially when fear and suspicion carried it forward. Someone in Red Mesa had spoken about what they believed they had seen the night before. Someone had decided it was worth investigating. Little Hawk noticed the change in Sarah's expression and turned toward the road as well. The boy's posture stiffened immediately. Even from far away he seemed to understand what approaching riders could mean in territory where trust was scarce. Sarah walked slowly toward the barn and rested one hand against the doorframe while watching the riders grow larger against the desert horizon. The 3 horses reached the fence line a few minutes later and stopped. Dust drifted around their legs as the men studied the quiet ranch before them. The rider in the center was a broad-shouldered man wearing a dark hat and a long coat despite the heat of the afternoon. Sarah recognized him as Caleb Turner, a ranch hand who had lived near Red Mesa for many years and who rarely spoke kindly about the Apache tribes moving through the distant mountains. The 2 men beside him remained silent while Caleb swung one leg over his saddle and stepped down onto the ground. His boots landed with a heavy thud in the dust. For a moment he simply looked across the yard at Sarah, his eyes slowly moving from the barn to the water pump and finally toward the small figure standing partially behind the barn door. The silence stretched long enough for the desert wind to rattle the loose boards of the fence. When Caleb finally spoke, his voice carried the rough edge of a man who believed he was asking a reasonable question even though the answer might already be known. He asked Sarah whether she had seen a young Apache child wandering through the valley during the past day. Sarah felt the weight of 3 sets of eyes watching her carefully. The moment had arrived where a single answer could decide everything that followed. Behind her, Little Hawk remained perfectly still, waiting quietly beside the barn wall while the warm desert wind moved through the valley and carried the dust of Red Mesa across the fading afternoon light. Caleb Turner's question hung in the warm desert air like dust that refused to settle. Sarah Whitmore stood beside the barn door with one hand resting against the rough wood, her eyes fixed calmly on the 3 men who had ridden across the valley to stand on her land. She understood the frontier well enough to know that moments like this could turn quickly depending on how a person chose their words. The wind shifted gently across the yard, carrying the smell of dry sage and distant heat rising from the earth. Caleb waited, his posture relaxed but his gaze sharp, the way a man watches for hesitation more than truth. Sarah answered carefully, her voice steady as she told him that travelers sometimes passed through the valley and that she had seen many things over the years living alone on the edge of Red Mesa. Caleb listened without interrupting, though the corner of his mouth tightened slightly as though he was weighing each word. One of the other riders leaned forward in the saddle and glanced toward the barn where Little Hawk stood partly hidden in the shadow of the doorway. The boy did not move. His small hands held the tin cup tightly while his eyes remained lowered toward the ground, as though he had already learned the frontier lesson that silence could sometimes protect a person better than courage. Caleb finally turned his attention toward the barn and took a few slow steps across the dusty yard. His boots pressed deep marks into the dry earth with every stride. Sarah moved slightly to the side but did not step away from the doorway. She understood what the men were trying to do. They were not searching for proof as much as they were searching for confirmation of a story that had already begun spreading through the town. Caleb stopped several feet away from the barn entrance and looked past Sarah toward the shadowed interior. The lantern still hung from its hook though it was no longer lit, and the faint smell of hay drifted outward through the open door. For a long moment no one spoke. The wind rattled the loose tin bucket beside the pump while the horses outside the fence shifted their weight impatiently. Then Caleb spoke again, this time with a tone that carried less curiosity and more warning. He told Sarah that people in Red Mesa had begun asking questions that morning. Some said they had seen a small figure crossing her fence line after sunset the night before. Others believed they had noticed smoke from her lantern burning late inside the barn. On the frontier, such details rarely stayed secret for long. Sarah met his gaze without anger, though a quiet firmness settled into her voice as she reminded him that her land was her responsibility and that travelers who came seeking water or rest were not uncommon in the Arizona desert. Caleb studied her expression carefully. It was clear he had not expected resistance. The two riders behind him shifted slightly in their saddles, exchanging glances as though unsure how far they intended to push the conversation. Finally Caleb stepped back toward the fence, brushing dust from his coat as he spoke one last time. He told Sarah that the town would not look kindly upon anyone who chose to shelter enemies within its borders. The Apache Wars had left wounds that many settlers still carried, and those memories shaped the way people judged loyalty. With that warning hanging between them, Caleb climbed back onto his horse. The three riders turned slowly toward the road and began riding back across the open valley toward Red Mesa, leaving only drifting dust behind them. Sarah watched until the figures disappeared beyond the low ridge. Only then did she turn toward the barn again, where Little Hawk still stood quietly in the shadow, understanding perhaps better than anyone that the danger had not passed but had only begun to grow. The desert grew quieter after the riders disappeared beyond the low ridge, yet the silence that settled over Sarah Whitmore's ranch no longer carried the same peaceful feeling it had earlier that day. Dust slowly drifted back to the ground along the road where Caleb Turner and the other men had ridden away, leaving the valley looking almost untouched again. But Sarah knew the frontier well enough to understand that words often traveled farther than horses. By the time those men returned to Red Mesa, the story would grow sharper with every telling. Sarah stepped away from the barn door and walked across the yard toward the fence line, watching the empty road for another moment as if measuring how quickly trouble might return. Behind her, Little Hawk finally moved from the shadow of the barn and stepped cautiously into the sunlight. The boy's eyes followed the distant road the same way Sarah's had, studying the horizon with the quiet alertness that children of the desert learned early in life. Sarah turned and offered him a small reassuring smile, though inside she could feel the weight of the situation pressing more heavily with every passing minute. The town of Red Mesa was not cruel by nature, but fear had shaped many of the people who lived there. Years of stories about raids and battles had built walls inside their minds that were often stronger than any wooden fence. Sarah walked back toward the barn and rested her hand gently on the boy's shoulder, guiding him inside where the shade offered relief from the growing afternoon heat. Inside the barn the air smelled of hay and dry wood. Sunlight slipped through narrow cracks between the boards, forming bright lines across the dusty floor. Sarah sat on the same wooden crate where she had rested the night before and studied the young traveler standing quietly nearby. She knew that keeping him here much longer would only make things more dangerous for both of them. If the town decided to send more men, they might not arrive with questions the next time. Yet sending the boy back into the open desert alone would be just as dangerous. The mountains Little Hawk had pointed toward earlier still lay many miles away across unforgiving land where water and shade were scarce. Sarah reached for a folded map that Thomas had once used while planning supply routes through the territory years ago. The paper was worn and faded, but it still showed the trails that crossed the valley and the narrow passes leading into the distant mountain ranges. She spread it across the workbench while Little Hawk stepped closer, watching carefully as she traced a finger along the path leading west. Sarah explained slowly that those mountains might hold people who knew his family, but reaching them would require traveling through the night when the desert air grew cooler. Little Hawk listened with quiet focus, nodding once when she finished speaking. Outside the barn the afternoon light had begun to soften as the sun drifted lower toward the horizon. The shadows stretching across the valley seemed longer now, and with them came the uneasy feeling that somewhere beyond the hills the town of Red Mesa was already deciding what should happen next. Sarah folded the old map again and placed it back on the bench. Then she looked toward the open desert where the mountains stood faint and blue against the fading sky. For the first time since the boy had appeared at her fence line, she began preparing for the possibility that the safest path forward might lead both of them into the night. The sun slipped lower behind the distant mesas as evening slowly settled across the valley, painting the desert in long shadows and soft orange light. Sarah Whitmore stood near the barn entrance watching the horizon while the warm wind of the day began to cool. The land around her ranch stretched wide and empty, yet she knew that somewhere beyond those hills the town of Red Mesa was already talking. Men like Caleb Turner did not ride across a valley simply to satisfy curiosity. They rode to warn, and warnings in frontier towns often grew into decisions before the next sunrise. Inside the barn Little Hawk carefully folded the thin blanket he had used the night before and placed it beside the hay bale. The boy's movements were quiet but purposeful, as if he understood that the time for waiting was ending. Sarah stepped inside and lit the lantern hanging from the beam above the workbench. The warm glow filled the barn with soft golden light while the outside sky slowly darkened into shades of deep blue and violet. She gathered a small canvas bag and began placing a few supplies inside. A piece of bread wrapped in cloth, a small tin of dried beans, a canteen of water, and the worn map that showed the narrow trails leading west toward the mountains. Each item went into the bag with careful thought. On the frontier, a person carried only what they could not live without. Little Hawk watched her quietly, his eyes following every movement as though memorizing the preparation. When Sarah finished tying the bag closed, she knelt beside him and spoke in the same calm voice she had used since the night they first met. She explained that the desert was safer after sunset when the air cooled and the long roads became quiet. If they followed the dry creek bed west of her property, it would lead them toward a narrow canyon that travelers sometimes used when crossing the territory. From there the land slowly climbed toward the mountain passes where Apache bands were known to move between hidden valleys. Little Hawk listened carefully and nodded once. The boy had spent enough time on the land to understand what she was planning. Outside the barn, the final light of day faded behind the red cliffs, leaving only a faint silver glow from the rising moon. The desert night began to awaken with distant sounds of wind brushing through the brush and the occasional cry of a night bird drifting across the open valley. Sarah stepped outside and looked toward the road leading back to Red Mesa. No riders appeared against the pale horizon, but that did not ease the quiet unease she felt. If the town decided to act, they would likely come after dark when fewer people would ask questions. She returned to the barn and gently guided one of the calmer horses from its stall. The animal stepped quietly into the yard, its breath visible in the cooling air. Sarah secured the small bag to the saddle and helped Little Hawk climb carefully onto the horse behind the saddle horn. The boy held on firmly while Sarah mounted behind him, steadying the reins in her hands. For a moment she looked back toward the small wooden house and the barn that had stood beside it for more than a decade. The ranch had been her home since the days when Thomas still walked these fields beside her. Leaving it even for a short journey felt heavier than she expected. Yet the frontier had always demanded difficult choices from those who lived upon it. Sarah turned the horse toward the western horizon where the mountains waited beneath the rising moon. The quiet path of the dry creek bed stretched ahead like a pale ribbon through the desert sand. With one gentle pull on the reins, the horse began moving forward into the night, carrying the widow and the young traveler away from the lonely ranch while the distant town of Red Mesa slept, unaware that the story unfolding beyond its borders had only just begun. The horse moved quietly along the pale trail of the dry creek bed while the moon climbed higher above the desert. Silver light washed across the open land, turning the sand and stone into soft shades of gray and blue. Sarah Whitmore kept the horse at a steady walking pace, careful not to rush the animal across ground that could hide loose rocks or shallow dips in the dark. In front of her, Little Hawk held the saddle horn with steady hands, his eyes fixed toward the western horizon where the dark shapes of distant mountains slowly grew clearer. The night air carried a cool breath that felt welcome after the long heat of the day. For a while neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the quiet rhythm of the horse's hooves and the gentle whisper of wind moving across the desert grass. Sarah knew the land well enough to guide them without needing the map every moment. The dry creek bed curved west through the valley like a natural road, one used by travelers for many years before the town of Red Mesa had even been built. Yet tonight the familiar path felt different. Every shadow seemed deeper, every distant ridge carried the possibility of riders watching from the dark. Behind them the ranch and the small barn were already far away, hidden somewhere beyond the rolling hills of the valley. Sarah did not look back again. After nearly an hour the land began to change slowly. The flat valley floor gave way to rougher ground where scattered stones and low brush dotted the creek bed. The mountains ahead rose taller now, their jagged outlines cutting sharply against the moonlit sky. Little Hawk shifted slightly in the saddle and pointed toward a narrow opening between two dark ridges. His voice was quiet but certain as he explained that he recognized those hills. His people had traveled through that passage many times while moving between seasonal camps. Sarah followed the direction of his hand and felt a small measure of relief settle in her chest. If the boy truly knew the land ahead, then their journey might bring them closer to safety sooner than she had hoped. Still she remained cautious. The frontier had taught her that the most dangerous moments often came when a traveler believed the hardest part of the journey was already behind them. The horse continued along the winding creek bed while the night deepened around them. Above, the desert sky stretched wide and clear, scattered with more stars than most townsfolk ever noticed from their windows. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, its voice echoing softly between the hills. Little Hawk listened to the sound and then spoke again, explaining that such calls often meant the land was undisturbed by large groups of riders nearby. Sarah nodded quietly. The boy's awareness of the desert reminded her that the Apache people had lived with this land far longer than the settlers of Red Mesa. They understood its signals in ways few others could. The path ahead narrowed as the creek bed entered a shallow canyon where tall stone walls rose on either side. Shadows gathered thickly between the rocks while the moonlight struggled to reach the ground below. Sarah slowed the horse as they approached the canyon entrance, studying the quiet passage carefully. For a long moment the world around them seemed completely still. Then, just as the horse stepped beneath the first shadow of the canyon wall, a distant sound drifted faintly through the night air behind them. It was far away but unmistakable to anyone who had spent enough years on the frontier. The steady echo of several horses moving across open ground, following the same trail that Sarah and Little Hawk had taken into the desert. Sarah Whitmore heard the sound again as the horse stepped deeper into the shadow of the canyon walls. The rhythm was distant but steady, carried through the cool night air in a way that made the sound travel farther across the desert than it would during the day. Several riders were following the same valley trail. Sarah did not pull the reins sharply or show alarm, because sudden movement could startle the horse and echo loudly through the narrow canyon. Instead she slowed the animal even more and guided it carefully along the rocky ground. Little Hawk had heard it as well. The boy turned his head slightly, listening with the quiet concentration of someone used to reading the land. After a moment he spoke softly, explaining that the canyon ahead curved sharply to the north before opening into a narrow passage filled with scattered boulders and tall desert grass. If they reached that place before the riders closed the distance, the horse's tracks might become harder to follow. Sarah nodded and guided the horse forward. The canyon walls rose higher around them now, blocking most of the moonlight so that only faint silver lines touched the tops of the rocks. The ground beneath the horses' hooves changed from soft sand to rough stone, which helped soften the sound of their movement. Behind them the faint rhythm of the distant riders continued, sometimes fading when the wind shifted, then returning again. Whoever followed was still far away, but they were moving steadily. The canyon path twisted gradually between tall stone formations shaped by centuries of wind and water. Small desert shrubs clung stubbornly to cracks in the rock while the dry creek bed narrowed into a winding trail. Sarah kept her eyes forward, trusting the horse to place its steps carefully among the stones. After several minutes the canyon opened slightly into the rocky passage Little Hawk had described. Large boulders scattered across the ground like silent guardians of the narrow valley, and tall grass moved gently in the night breeze. Sarah guided the horse behind one of the larger rock formations and paused. The animal stood quietly, breathing slow clouds into the cool air. For a moment the canyon seemed completely still except for the soft rustling of grass and the distant cry of a night bird. Little Hawk slid carefully from the saddle and crouched beside the rocks, studying the ground the way his people had likely taught him. He brushed loose sand over several of the horse's tracks and then pointed toward a narrow path climbing between two stone ridges. That trail, he explained, led upward to a higher ledge where travelers could move along the side of the canyon without leaving clear marks in the sand below. Sarah felt a quiet respect for the boy's knowledge. Without another word she dismounted and led the horse slowly toward the narrow passage he had shown her. The climb was gentle but careful, winding upward along a rocky slope where scattered stones helped hide the trail of hooves. When they reached the ledge above the canyon floor, the valley stretched below them in pale moonlight. From that height Sarah could see far across the open desert behind them. And after a long moment of watching the distant trail, she finally saw small moving shapes appear near the canyon entrance. Several riders had reached the valley behind them and were now following the path into the canyon, their figures faint but unmistakable beneath the moonlit sky. From the narrow ledge high along the canyon wall, Sarah Whitmore remained perfectly still in the saddle while she watched the valley below. The moonlight washed the canyon floor in pale silver, making the scattered rocks and dry sand glow softly against the darkness. At first the riders appeared only as faint moving shapes near the canyon entrance, but as Sarah's eyes adjusted she could clearly see there were 4 of them now instead of 3. They rode slowly into the canyon, their horses stepping cautiously across the uneven ground while dust rose lightly around their hooves. Little Hawk crouched beside the rocks near the horse's shoulder and studied the scene with careful focus. His expression remained calm, yet there was a quiet understanding in his eyes that the people following them would not turn back easily. Sarah leaned slightly forward in the saddle and kept her voice low when she spoke, asking whether the higher trail continued beyond the ridge. Little Hawk nodded and pointed along the narrow ledge where the path curved deeper into the mountains. According to him, the trail would eventually lead to a hidden valley where springs flowed year-round and where Apache travelers sometimes rested during long journeys across the territory. The knowledge brought Sarah a small sense of hope, but she knew they still needed to move carefully. Below them the riders had begun searching the canyon floor. One man dismounted and walked slowly across the sand while the others remained on horseback, scanning the rocky walls as though expecting movement above them. From their position high on the ledge, Sarah and Little Hawk remained hidden among the shadows. The horse shifted its weight quietly but did not make a sound loud enough to echo down the canyon. After several tense minutes the riders moved farther along the canyon floor, following the visible trail where hoofprints had once marked the sand before Little Hawk had brushed them away. Their lantern light flickered faintly as one of the men held it up to examine the ground more closely. Yet the rocky stretch where the tracks disappeared seemed to confuse them. From above, Sarah could see them speaking among themselves while pointing toward the different paths twisting between the canyon walls. The uncertainty slowed them. Finally Caleb Turner raised his arm and directed the riders farther along the canyon floor rather than toward the narrow ridge trail hidden above them. One by one the horses continued deeper into the canyon, their figures gradually disappearing behind the tall stone formations farther below. Sarah waited several minutes longer to make certain the riders had truly moved on. Only when the canyon floor returned to quiet did she gently guide the horse forward along the narrow ledge. The trail curved upward between dark rocks where moonlight barely reached the ground. The climb was slow but steady, and after a short distance the ledge widened enough for the horse to walk more comfortably. As they continued higher into the mountains, the view behind them slowly disappeared beneath rising cliffs and winding ridges. The distant riders were no longer visible, and the canyon returned to the peaceful silence of the desert night. Sarah exhaled softly, realizing how tightly she had been holding her breath. Ahead of them the trail stretched toward a higher plateau where the first faint outline of tall pine trees appeared against the sky. The land was changing now, leaving the open desert behind and entering the rugged country where Apache travelers had moved for generations. Somewhere beyond those ridges, Sarah hoped, people might be waiting who would recognize the young boy riding before her and welcome him home. The trail continued climbing through the rugged mountains while the night slowly deepened around them. Sarah Whitmore guided the horse along the narrow path where small pine trees began replacing the low desert brush of the valley below. The air felt cooler here, carrying the faint scent of mountain soil and dry needles beneath the horse's hooves. For the first time since leaving her ranch, Sarah felt the land itself offering a kind of quiet protection. The tall ridges and winding trails of this country could hide travelers far better than the open desert ever could. Little Hawk remained steady in front of her on the saddle, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead with growing familiarity. After some time he pointed toward a higher ridge where the path curved between large stone outcrops. He explained softly that beyond that ridge the land opened into a sheltered valley where water flowed from a narrow spring hidden among the rocks. Travelers from his people often stopped there when moving between the mountains and the desert plains. Sarah nodded and followed the direction of the trail. The horse climbed steadily, its breath forming faint clouds in the cool air while the moonlight filtered through the branches above. After nearly half an hour the path finally leveled, and the ground widened into a quiet clearing surrounded by tall pines and rugged stone walls. A narrow stream of water trickled through the center of the valley, its soft sound echoing gently through the still night. Sarah guided the horse toward the edge of the clearing and stopped, listening carefully to the sounds around them. The mountains remained silent except for the whisper of wind moving through the trees. Little Hawk slid carefully from the saddle and knelt beside the small stream, cupping water in his hands. The boy drank slowly before looking back toward the surrounding forest with quiet recognition. There was a calmness in his expression now that Sarah had not seen since the night he appeared at her fence line. It was the look of someone standing on land that felt closer to home. Sarah dismounted and allowed the horse to drink as well while she studied the shadows beyond the clearing. The journey had been long, yet she knew their path might soon cross with others who knew these mountains better than she did. The Apache people moved through this country with skill and awareness passed down through generations. If any nearby band had seen the distant riders in the canyon earlier, they might already be watching the valley from the surrounding ridges. As Sarah finished securing the horse near a tree, a faint movement appeared among the tall pines at the edge of the clearing. It was subtle enough that someone unfamiliar with the wilderness might have missed it entirely. A dark figure stepped quietly from the shadows between the trees, followed by another and then a third. They moved calmly but with confidence, their posture upright and watchful. Moonlight revealed the outlines of boughs slung across their backs and long hair tied neatly behind their shoulders. The Apache warriors had been observing the clearing in silence. One of them stepped forward slightly, his expression calm yet serious as his eyes moved from Sarah to the young boy standing near the stream. Little Hawk's face brightened with sudden recognition. He spoke quickly in his own language, his voice carrying relief that needed no translation. The warrior listened carefully before nodding once. Then his gaze returned to Sarah Whitmore, the widow who had ridden through the desert night to bring the child safely into the mountains where his people waited. The clearing remained quiet except for the gentle sound of the small stream moving across smooth stones. Sarah Whitmore stood beside the horse with one hand resting lightly on the saddle while she watched the Apache warriors who had stepped from the shadows of the pine trees. There were 4 of them now, each moving with the calm awareness of men who had spent their lives in these mountains. Their presence did not carry the reckless anger Sarah had seen in some frontier towns. Instead they watched carefully, measuring every detail of the moment before speaking or acting. The warrior who had stepped forward first appeared older than the others. Moonlight revealed faint lines along his face and a quiet authority in the way the others positioned themselves slightly behind him. Little Hawk spoke quickly again in his language, pointing once toward Sarah as if explaining how he had arrived in the mountains. The older warrior listened without interruption. When the boy finished, the man nodded slowly and placed a steady hand on Little Hawk's shoulder. The gesture carried both relief and reassurance. The boy's long journey through the desert had finally ended among people who recognized him. The warrior then turned his attention toward Sarah. His gaze was firm but not hostile, studying the tired horse, the dust on her clothes, and the small travel bag tied behind the saddle. Though Sarah did not understand the language he spoke, the tone of his voice carried clear meaning when he addressed the other men. 2 of the warriors moved quietly toward the edge of the clearing, their eyes scanning the surrounding ridges while the others remained nearby. It was the behavior of men who expected travelers to be followed. Sarah understood immediately that news of the riders in the canyon had already been considered. She spoke calmly, explaining in simple words that men from the town of Red Mesa had begun searching for the boy and had followed their trail into the mountains earlier that night. Though the warriors might not understand every word, the direction of her gesture toward the canyon helped explain the danger. The older warrior listened carefully. After a moment he nodded again and spoke quietly to the others. One of the younger men moved toward the trees and disappeared among the shadows of the higher ridge, likely climbing to a lookout point where the canyon trail could be seen from above. The remaining warriors stayed near the clearing, their calm presence forming a quiet circle of protection around the spring. Little Hawk now stood closer to Sarah, though the fear that had once filled his eyes was gone. In its place was gratitude and a kind of quiet pride that he had returned safely to his people. The older warrior stepped forward once more and spoke slowly in careful English that carried the deep accent of someone who had learned the language from long contact with settlers and traders. He thanked Sarah for bringing the child safely through the desert night. His voice was steady and respectful. Sarah felt a small wave of relief wash over her, realizing that the difficult journey had not been made in vain. Yet the man's expression soon turned thoughtful as he looked toward the distant ridges beyond the clearing. He explained that if riders from Red Mesa had entered the canyon, they would soon discover that the trail no longer continued along the valley floor. Men who felt embarrassed or angered by such confusion sometimes rode farther into the mountains searching for answers. The Apache people understood this land well, but strangers often did not. For a long moment the clearing remained still while the sound of wind moved softly through the tall pines. Then the warrior looked back toward Sarah and spoke again with quiet certainty. The mountains had already seen enough conflict between settlers and tribes over the years. Tonight, he said, there would be no need for more trouble. His people would guide the riders away from these valleys before the sun rose, while Sarah Whitmore would be given time to rest beside the spring before beginning the long journey back toward the world she had left behind beyond the desert. The cool mountain air moved gently through the tall pines while the small spring continued its quiet song across the stones. Sarah Whitmore sat beside the water with her back resting against a smooth rock, feeling the deep exhaustion that finally comes after danger begins to pass. Nearby, Little Hawk spoke softly with the Apache warriors, his voice carrying a calm confidence that had not been present when he first appeared at her fence line days earlier. The boy now stood among his own people, and the tension that once filled his small shoulders had slowly faded. The older warrior who had spoken with Sarah earlier walked a short distance away from the group and looked toward the eastern ridges where the canyon trail disappeared into darkness. The mountains remained silent, but every man in the clearing understood that riders from Red Mesa were somewhere beyond those rocks searching for answers. After several quiet minutes, the warrior who had climbed the ridge earlier returned to the clearing. He spoke briefly in Apache, explaining that the riders had indeed followed the canyon floor for a time but had eventually turned toward another valley farther south after losing the trail. The strangers were now moving away from the hidden passage that led to the spring. A calm sense of relief passed through the warriors as they listened. The older man nodded once, then turned back toward Sarah. In slow, careful English he explained that his people had watched the canyon paths for many seasons and knew many ways to guide travelers away from places they should not enter. By the time the sun rose, the men from Red Mesa would likely believe the trail had ended somewhere among the rocky hills. Sarah listened quietly, grateful not only for their help but also for the peaceful way they had chosen to handle the situation. Too many stories from the frontier had ended differently when fear and anger met in the same place. The warrior then told her something that made Sarah pause. News traveled through the mountains just as it traveled through towns. Apache scouts had heard rumors that a child had been separated from his relatives days earlier during a tense encounter with riders near the plains. Little Hawk's family had been searching the mountain valleys ever since. Not long after he finished speaking, two figures appeared along the far edge of the clearing. A woman and an older man stepped carefully from the trees, their faces illuminated softly by the moonlight filtering through the branches. Little Hawk saw them first. The boy ran forward across the clearing with a sudden burst of joy that needed no translation. The woman knelt and wrapped her arms around him while the older man placed a steady hand on the boy's shoulder. Their quiet reunion carried more emotion than any words could have explained. Sarah watched from beside the spring, feeling a warm sense of relief settle deep in her chest. The long journey through the desert had brought the child safely home. After some time the older warrior returned to Sarah and thanked her once more for the courage she had shown in helping the boy. Acts of kindness between strangers were rare in troubled times, he said, but they were remembered long after anger faded. Sarah nodded quietly, her thoughts drifting back to the lonely ranch and the small barn standing in the valley below. When the first pale hint of dawn finally touched the mountain peaks, she knew it would soon be time to begin the long ride back across the desert. Yet she also understood that something important had changed. The frontier was often described as a place divided between enemies, but that night in the mountains had shown a different truth. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do on the harsh edge of the world was simply choose to help someone who needed it. Dawn arrived slowly. Over the mountain ridges, spilling soft golden light across the quiet valley where the small spring flowed between the stones. Sarah Whitmore stood beside her horse, tightening the saddle strap while the cool morning air carried the scent of pine and fresh water. Around the clearing the Apache warriors were already moving quietly, preparing to guide Little Hawk and his family deeper into the mountain country where travelers from the towns rarely ventured. The boy remained close to his relatives now, but before leaving he walked back toward Sarah with the shy determination of someone who understood that this moment mattered. He stopped a few steps away and looked up at her with the same steady eyes she had first seen beside the barn days earlier. Though his English was still careful, the meaning of his words came clearly. He thanked her for helping him when no one else would. Sarah knelt so that she could meet his gaze at the same level and told him that the frontier often looked harsh, but it was still a place where people could choose to do the right thing. The boy nodded and returned to his family, where the older warrior who had spoken with Sarah earlier waited beside the trees. Before leaving, the man approached Sarah one last time. In calm English he explained that the riders from Red Mesa had already turned their search toward the southern hills during the night, believing the trail had ended somewhere in the canyon. By the time they realized the truth, the mountains would hide every path that mattered. He paused for a moment, then added that kindness shown in difficult times was never forgotten among his people. Sarah thanked him quietly. The journey had been long and uncertain, but seeing the boy safely reunited with his family made every mile through the desert worthwhile. As the sun climbed higher above the peaks, the warriors began moving through the trees, guiding Little Hawk and his relatives along a narrow trail that disappeared into the deeper forests beyond the valley. Within minutes the clearing grew quiet again, leaving only Sarah, her horse, and the gentle sound of the spring. She mounted the saddle and turned the horse toward the eastern ridges where the desert stretched far beyond the mountains. The ride back to her ranch would take most of the day, and she knew the town of Red Mesa might still carry whispers about the choices she had made. Yet Sarah felt a calm strength settle inside her as she began guiding the horse down the trail. The frontier had always tested people in ways they never expected. Some responded with fear, others with anger, but a few chose something different. As the widow rode out of the mountain valley and back toward the wide desert horizon, the rising sun cast long light across the land, and the quiet story of one small act of compassion continued traveling farther than any rumor that might still linger in the streets of Red Mesa. The trail down from the mountains carried Sarah Whitmore slowly back toward the wide desert valley, the morning sun rising steadily behind her as the cool air of the higher ridges began to warm. Her horse moved carefully along the rocky path, stepping between scattered stones and dry brush while long shadows stretched across the ground. Sarah paused once near a bend in the trail and looked back toward the high forested slopes where the hidden spring lay beyond the ridge. Somewhere in those mountains Little Hawk was now safely with his family, moving deeper into the valleys where his people understood every trail, every wind, and every hidden canyon. The thought brought Sarah a quiet sense of peace. She turned the horse again and continued the descent toward the open desert below. By late morning the tall pines slowly gave way to scattered juniper and then to the familiar low brush of the Arizona plains. The land widened once more into the broad valley where heat shimmered gently above the sand and stone. In the far distance she could already see the thin trail of dust that marked the road leading toward Red Mesa. Sarah knew returning to town would not be simple. Rumors had a way of spreading through frontier streets faster than any stagecoach, and the story of a widow sheltering an Apache child would not fade easily from people's memories. Yet she also understood something the riders from Red Mesa might never fully grasp. The frontier was not only shaped by fear and suspicion. It was also shaped by the quiet choices individuals made when no one else was watching. By early afternoon Sarah reached the edge of her property. The small wooden house stood exactly where she had left it, weathered but steady beneath the wide desert sky. Nearby the barn still showed the dark marks of the fire that had been set during the night before she fled into the desert. The sight of it stirred a brief ache in her chest, but she guided the horse calmly into the yard and dismounted. The ranch was quiet except for the wind brushing gently across the fence posts and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the valley. Sarah walked slowly toward the barn and ran her hand along the rough wooden boards that had once been built by Thomas so many years earlier. Damage could be repaired. Wood could be replaced. What mattered more was the simple truth that the ranch still stood, just as the land itself continued to stand through every conflict that passed across it. Later that afternoon Sarah rode into Red Mesa to gather supplies for repairing the barn roof. As she walked along the dusty street, several townspeople paused to watch her pass. Some faces showed curiosity, others quiet uncertainty. Caleb Turner stood outside the saloon with two of the same men who had ridden with him the day before. For a moment their eyes met across the street. Caleb studied her expression carefully, perhaps searching for confirmation of the rumors he had helped spread. Sarah said nothing. She simply continued walking toward the general store with calm, steady steps. On the frontier, truth often revealed itself slowly over time. The men from Red Mesa had searched the desert and the canyons but had found nothing except their own confusion among the rocks. And sometimes that was the only answer the land itself was willing to give. As the sun lowered toward the red cliffs beyond town, Sarah Whitmore finished her errands and began riding back toward the quiet ranch on the edge of the valley. Behind her the streets of Red Mesa slowly returned to their ordinary rhythm, but the story of what had happened beyond the desert hills would travel quietly through the territory for years to come. It would not be told as a tale of conflict or victory. Instead it would be remembered as the morning when the frontier learned that even in a harsh land shaped by suspicion and fear, a single act of kindness could ride farther than any horse across the open desert. Evening settled slowly across the valley as Sarah Whitmore rode the final stretch of road back toward her ranch. The sky above the Arizona desert turned deep shades of orange and violet while long shadows stretched across the open land. Her horse walked at an easy pace, tired from the long journey but steady beneath her hands. Ahead, the small ranch house and the darkened outline of the barn stood quietly against the fading light. The place looked worn but familiar, the same lonely homestead that had carried Sarah through years of drought, storms, and hard winters after Thomas passed away. She dismounted beside the fence and led the horse toward the water trough, letting the animal drink while she studied the barn again. The burn marks along the wooden boards were clear reminders of the anger that had swept through Red Mesa only a day earlier. Yet standing there beneath the calm evening sky, Sarah no longer felt the same weight of fear she had carried before riding into the mountains. The journey had changed something inside her. She had seen that the world beyond the town's rumors was larger and more complex than the stories people told one another. She spent the next hour repairing part of the damaged roof, working slowly as the final light faded from the horizon. By the time darkness covered the valley, a lantern glowed softly inside the barn while the ranch settled into its quiet nighttime rhythm. The wind brushed gently through the sagebrush and the distant sound of coyotes echoed across the desert. Later that night Sarah sat on the wooden steps of her porch, looking out across the open land stretching toward the distant mountains. Somewhere beyond those ridges Little Hawk and his family were continuing their lives among people who understood the land as home rather than territory to conquer. The thought gave her a quiet sense of satisfaction. In the days that followed, Red Mesa slowly returned to its usual routine. Wagons rolled through the dusty streets, the blacksmith's hammer rang across the square, and travelers stopped at the saloon to share news from distant towns. The story about the missing Apache child eventually faded into uncertain rumor. Caleb Turner and the other riders never found the proof they had expected in the canyon, and without proof even the most confident accusations lost their strength. People still watched Sarah with curiosity when she came into town for supplies, but none of them spoke openly against her again. On the frontier, respect often returned quietly when a person stood firm without anger. Weeks passed, and the damaged barn was slowly repaired board by board. One clear afternoon as Sarah worked beside the fence, she noticed something unusual tied carefully to one of the wooden posts near the edge of her property. It was a small leather pouch decorated with simple beadwork in blue and white patterns. Inside the pouch rested a smooth stone and a thin braided cord. Sarah held the object gently in her hand, recognizing it as a kind of protective charm sometimes carried by Apache travelers. She looked toward the western horizon where the distant mountains rose beyond the desert haze. No riders stood there, no voices called across the valley, but the quiet message was clear enough. Kindness given freely had been remembered. Sarah placed the small pouch safely inside the house before returning to her work beneath the wide desert sky. The frontier would continue to test the people who lived upon it, just as it always had. But somewhere between the dusty streets of Red Mesa and the hidden valleys of the mountains, a quiet understanding had taken root, carried by a single journey through the desert night and by the courage of a widow who chose compassion when the world expected something else. The desert summer moved forward slowly, day after day, as life on the edge of Red Mesa returned to its steady rhythm. Sarah Whitmore spent long mornings repairing fence lines and tending the small fields beside her house while the sun climbed over the red cliffs beyond the valley. The barn roof had been fully restored now, its new boards still lighter in color than the older wood around them. From a distance it almost looked as though the damage from that night had never happened at all. Yet Sarah remembered it clearly, not with bitterness but with the calm understanding that the frontier often revealed the true nature of people during moments of fear. One quiet afternoon several weeks after her journey into the mountains, a small group of riders appeared along the distant road leading from Red Mesa. Sarah noticed them while drawing water from the pump and paused to watch their approach. At first she assumed they were travelers passing through the valley, but as they came closer she recognized one of the riders at the front. It was Caleb Turner. The man rode more slowly than before, his posture thoughtful rather than confrontational. Two other men rode with him, but they remained slightly behind as Caleb guided his horse toward the fence. Sarah set the bucket down and waited calmly beside the pump. When Caleb reached the gate, he removed his hat and held it loosely in his hands for a moment before speaking. His voice lacked the sharp suspicion it had carried on the day he first rode to her barn. Instead there was a trace of quiet humility in the way he chose his words. He explained that the riders had searched the southern valleys for several days after losing the trail in the canyon. They had found nothing except empty desert and twisting rock passages that led nowhere. Over time the story had begun to feel less certain even among the men who had believed it most strongly. Caleb looked toward the repaired barn and nodded slowly as if acknowledging something he had not understood before. He admitted that perhaps the town had been too quick to judge what it did not fully see. The frontier had always been a difficult place, he said, where fear often spoke louder than patience. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she simply told him that sometimes the desert had its own way of guiding travelers where they needed to go. Caleb studied her expression for a moment longer, then gave a small respectful nod. He placed his hat back on his head and turned his horse toward the road without another word. The riders left as quietly as they had come, disappearing once again across the wide open valley beneath the endless sky. Sarah watched them until they became small shapes against the distant dust. Then she returned to her work beside the pump while the warm desert wind moved softly across the fields. The frontier had not changed overnight, and it likely never would. But somewhere between suspicion and understanding, a quiet lesson had taken root in Red Mesa. And in the lonely valley where a widow once chose kindness over fear, life continued beneath the vast western sky, steady and enduring like the land itself. Some people in Red Mesa would later say they never truly knew what happened in the desert that night. They would speak about rumors, about a missing child, about riders who searched the canyons and returned with nothing but dust on their boots and questions in their minds. But the land itself knew the truth. It had watched a tired widow open her barn door to a frightened child when turning him away would have been easier. It had watched a quiet ride beneath the moon across miles of open desert where fear could have easily won. And it had watched a small boy step safely back into the arms of his family among the mountains where his people had lived long before the town of Red Mesa was ever built. Sarah Whitmore never spoke much about that journey. Life on the frontier did not leave much time for stories, and there were fences to mend, animals to tend, and long days of work beneath the wide Arizona sky. Yet the people of Red Mesa slowly began to understand something that could not be explained by rumors alone. The widow who had once been judged so quickly continued living her quiet life with the same steady strength she had always carried. The barn still stood, the ranch still worked, and the desert wind still moved across the valley just as it always had. Sometimes travelers passing through the territory would hear a small part of the story from someone in the saloon or beside the general store. They would hear about the morning when riders searched the canyon and found no trail. They would hear about the widow who refused to deny helping a child in need. And they would hear that somewhere beyond the distant mountains there were people who remembered that act of courage long after the dust had settled in Red Mesa. The frontier had always been a hard land where suspicion often rode faster than truth. But every once in a while, the desert reminded those who lived upon it of something far more powerful. In a world shaped by fear, a single act of kindness could travel farther than any horse, crossing deserts, canyons, and mountains until it became something no rumor could ever erase.